When a low-ranking wolf was found in the sacred grove during the Alpha King's private ceremony, there was a procedure. The elders knew it. The guard wolves knew it. Every wolf in 4 territories who had ever studied pack law knew it. The trespasser was removed immediately, quietly, and the ceremony continued as though the interruption had never occurred. Trespass on sacred ground during the king's ritual was not punished publicly. Public acknowledgement would dignify the offense. The procedure was silence, removal, erasure. Sera had known this when she hid in the sacred grove. She had hidden there anyway, because the alternative was worse. The guard wolves found her in the 3rd hour of the ceremony, crouched behind the ancient silverwood tree at the grove's northern edge, her knees pressed into the cold moss, her breathing as controlled as she could make it. They flanked her. One reached for her arm, and then the Alpha King, standing 40 feet away at the ceremony's center, lifted his head. He did not look at the guard wolves. He did not look at the ground or the altar or the sacred fire that had been burning since sundown. He looked directly at her. The guard wolf's hand stopped moving. The entire ceremony stopped moving. 100 wolves in the sacred grove went absolutely silent as their king took one step, unhurried, deliberate, inexplicable, toward the low-ranking nobody crouching behind the silverwood tree. The procedure had never accounted for this. Chapter 1. The petition had taken her 3 years to prepare. Sera understood in retrospect that this was its own kind of information, that a document requiring 3 years of careful construction to feel ready for submission was a document she had known on some level was going to need to be perfect, because the margin for imperfection was 0. She had known this the way you knew things you had learned through the accumulated evidence of a lifetime rather than through a single instructive event. Not a lesson, a sediment. She had been a low-rank wolf in Ashenmore Pack for 22 years. She had been a low-rank wolf the way some things were done carefully, thoroughly, with full attention to what the classification required of her and what it precluded and where, if anywhere, the space between requirement and preclusion might offer something worth reaching for. But the gray cord on her wrist had been there since she was old enough to be classified. She did not remember the morning it appeared. She had been 4, perhaps 5, and the memory that remained was not of the cord itself, but of her mother's expression when the classification elder tied it. The specific careful neutrality of a woman receiving information she had been half prepared for and was determined not to let become despair in front of her daughter. Sera had worn it every day since. She had also, every day since, been doing the thing that the council's verdict would later name with surgical precision. Trying to be worth something. Training harder than the wolves above her rank. Volunteering for the assignments no one else wanted. Showing up early and leaving late, and applying the particular quality of effort that she had believed, had to believe, because the alternative was the sediment, was the mechanism by which the gray cord could eventually be reclassified into something else. 3 years of documentation, service records, training assessments, border watch evaluations, each one graded by supervisors who had written things like exceptional and asset to the watch, and performs at consistently above rank level without anyone appearing to notice the implication of those assessments for the rank itself. She had bound them carefully. She had written the petition's cover in her best hand. She had submitted it through the correct formal channel, the pack administrator's office, not directly to the council, because the correct channel mattered, and she had learned early that wolves who bypassed correct channels were dismissed on procedure before their content was ever considered. The council session had been scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. She had not slept well on Monday night. The chamber was circular and old, with the particular quality of rooms that had absorbed a great deal of significant decision-making over many years. Not weight exactly, but a density of accumulated consequence that she had always found both intimidating and clarifying. She had stood at its center and watched Lord Edrin, Pack Alpha of Ashenmoor, receive her petition from the administrator's hand and open it with the specific quality of attention of a man who had already decided what he was going to do with the contents and was reviewing them for form rather than substance. He read for approximately 90 seconds. Then he looked up. Not at her. Past her, at the middle distance that powerful people addressed when they were delivering something they did not consider worth the directness of eye contact. That girl, he said, has spent her entire life trying to be worth something to this pack. Sera held still. She never has been, he said. She never will be. Some wolves are simply born beneath the level where effort makes a difference. He handed the petition back to the administrator. The council said nothing. Sera said nothing. She stood at the center of the circular chamber and felt the words land on the architecture she had built. 3 years of documentation, 22 years of effort, the accumulated sediment of a life organized around the belief that the threshold existed and was reachable. And she felt that architecture do something she had not designed it to do, not collapse, clarify. The clarity was this. There was no threshold. There had never been a threshold. The threshold was something she had invented to explain the gap between what she did and what she received for doing it. And the gap was not a gap she had failed to close. It was a policy. Edrin had just stated the policy in front of the council and the administrator and the afternoon light, as plainly as a thing could be stated. She was low rank. She would die low rank. The gray cord on her wrist was not a classification awaiting revision. It was a verdict. She turned. She walked out of the chamber. She walked through the pack grounds and into the forest, because the forest was the only direction that was not back toward the chamber or further into a pack that had just, formally and without apology, told her what it thought of her. She walked for a long time. She did not plan to enter the sacred grove. She did not plan anything in those hours. She was operating below the level of planning, in the specific territory of a person who has received something definitive and needs the physical act of movement to process it. Left foot, right foot, trees, cold air, the gray cord against her wrist in the dark. She became aware of the grove's boundary, the ancient silverwood markers, the particular quality of silence that distinguished sacred ground from ordinary forest. At approximately the same moment she became aware that she had no other direction left to walk in tonight, without crossing into territory that would require explanations she did not have the energy to construct. She stopped at the boundary. She stood there for a moment. She stepped across it. The sacred grove was everything the stories said. Ancient, dense, the kind of dark that was not the absence of light, but the presence of something older than light. The silverwood trees stood at their ceremonial positions around the grove's perimeter, their pale bark catching whatever ambient light existed and returning it in the particular silver that gave them their name. She found the largest one at the northern edge, and she sat down behind it with her back against its cool bark and her knees drawn up and the gray cord against her wrist, and she let the grove's specific quality of silence settle around her. She was not supposed to be here. She had known this before she crossed the boundary. She had crossed it anyway, because the alternative was the forest road back to Ashenmoor, and she could not, tonight, go back to the place that had just told her she was furniture. She had been there for perhaps 2 hours when the ceremony began. She had not known about the ceremony. This was the truth she would later tell, and it was the truth. She had not known the Alpha King was coming, had not known the annual ritual fell on this particular Tuesday, had not known that the grove she had hidden in was about to become the most significant ceremonial space in 4 territories for the next 3 hours. By the time she understood what was happening, the torches, the gathering wolves, the particular processional quality of movement that indicated something formal and sacred was occurring. She was already inside the boundary and already behind the silverwood tree, and the only available options were to remain completely still and hope, or to stand up in the middle of the Alpha King's ceremony and announce herself. And the first option seemed marginally less catastrophic than the second. She remained still. She was very good at remaining still. She remained still for 2 hours. Then the guard wolves found her, and everything that came after was a consequence of being found, and none of it followed the procedure. Chapter 2. The private receiving chamber of the king's traveling court was a room that had not been designed to impress. This was the first thing Sera noticed about it. The specific absence of ceremony in a space that had every reason to perform ceremony, if ceremony had been the point. No elevated platform. No formal arrangement of furniture to establish hierarchy. A working fire. 2 chairs of equivalent size placed at an angle to each other, a small table between them bearing a water service that had clearly been set out in advance of her arrival. She noted all of this in the time it took Kalen Voss, Alpha King of the 4 territories, ruler of the most significant ceremonial space in the known pack world, the man who had stopped his own ritual to walk toward her, to enter from the adjoining room and sit in one of the chairs with the particular lack of ceremony that she had already, in the 40 minutes since the grove, begun to understand was his consistent register. He was younger than she had expected. Not young, perhaps 30, with the particular quality of someone who had held significant authority long enough that it had stopped requiring performance, but younger than the weight of his title suggested. Dark-haired, still in the ceremonial clothes, which on him looked like working clothes because he wore them without the self-consciousness of someone aware of what they represented. He looked at her wrist first, at the gray cord, then at her face, in with the specific directness of someone who had decided to look at the thing he was actually looking at rather than the space beside it. You are not there to watch the ceremony, he said. It was not an accusation, it was the beginning of an accounting. No, she said. I was there because I had nowhere else to go tonight. The council session, he said. She looked at him. You know about the petition. I know about Idrin, he said. His governance record has been in review by my council for 14 months. Your petition and its outcome are documented in that review. She absorbed this. She filed it in the category of things that were significant and which she did not yet have sufficient context to fully interpret. I have a proposal, he said. She waited. The annual ceremonial season runs for 4 more weeks. I require a formal point of continuity in the sacred records, a witness to tonight's interrupted ceremony who can provide documentation of what occurred before the interruption to satisfy the record's requirements for completeness. He paused. You are the only wolf present who occupies that position. That is a pretext, she said. Something moved in his expression, brief, controlled. It is a thin one, he said. Yes. What is the actual proposal? She said. He looked at her for a moment. At the directness of the question, which she delivered without apology because she had run out of energy tonight for anything except the direct line between 2 points. Stay at the king's court for the duration of the ceremonial season, he said. 4 weeks, under royal protection, with full court standing for that period. At the season's end, you return to Ashenmoor or go wherever you choose, with no claim on you from any direction. What do I do for 4 weeks? She said. Whatever work you are capable of, he said. Which I expect is considerable. She studied him. I will not be a spectacle. I will not be a curiosity that the court examines and discusses. I will have real work and real standing, and I will be treated as someone who is present and reached for the writing materials on the small table as though he had anticipated this condition and had placed them there in advance of needing them, which she suspected he had. She watched him write and felt the gray cord on her wrist and thought about the council chamber that afternoon and the procedure that had not been followed and the 40 feet between her hiding place and the ceremony's center that he had crossed without hesitation. And she thought about what kind of person did that and why. She did not yet have enough information to answer the question. She was going to find out. He finished writing and turned the document toward her for review. She read it carefully. Every word. It said exactly what he had said it would say. She looked at the seal at the bottom, at his name beneath it. Why? She said, without looking up from the document. Why what? He said. Why any of it? The walking toward me, the chamber, the proposal. You could have followed the procedure. I would have been removed and the ceremony would have continued and nothing would have been disrupted. He was quiet for a moment. You held still, he said, when the guard reached for you. You did not run. You did not beg. You simply held still and waited for whatever was going to happen. She looked up. Most wolves in your position, he said, would have broken. The combination of trespass on sacred ground, discovery during the king's ceremony, and the specific quality of night you had already had before any of that, most wolves would have shattered under the weight of it. She said nothing. You didn't, he said. And I wanted to know why. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she looked back at the document and picked up the pen he had left beside it and signed her name at the bottom. She stood. Running, she said as she moved toward the door, was never going to help. She heard behind her the particular quality of silence that followed a statement that had landed somewhere. It was going to remain for a while. She walked out into the King's Court corridor and into the beginning of 4 weeks that she was going to approach with the same precision she had brought to everything else, carefully, with full attention, and without letting herself build more on the foundation than the foundation had been contracted to hold. She almost managed this. Chapter 3. The King's Court operated at a frequency Sera had not previously encountered, and took approximately 48 hours to calibrate to. It was not the size of it, though it was considerably larger than anything Ashenmore offered. It was not the formality, though the formality was real and layered in the specific way of institutions that had been doing the same things for a very long time and had refined the doing into something close to art. It was the quality of attention. Everyone in the King's Court paid attention to everything, all of the time, with the focused awareness of wolves who understood that in a space where the most significant decisions in 4 territories were made, information was the primary currency, and the failure to notice things was a form of poverty. Sera had spent 22 years being underestimated. She discovered in the first week of the King's Court that underestimation in a space this attentive was the most useful tool available. She was given the Eastern Records Hall and a clear brief: review, organize, and document the ceremonial records for the current season. It was real work. The records were genuinely in need of the attention they received, and she gave it the same quality of effort she had given everything she had ever been assigned, which was complete. She arrived first and left last. She cross-referenced the historical precedents with the current season's variations. She produced documentation that the senior archivist reviewed on day 6 and returned with a single annotation in the margin: thorough. She filed this under evidence and kept working. Kaelin came to the Eastern Records Hall on the 4th day with a query about the 3rd ceremony's historical precedents that his ceremonial secretary had been unable to resolve. She resolved it in 11 minutes, using 2 cross-references she had identified the previous morning. He listened to her explanation with the full attention she had come to understand was his consistent approach to receiving information, not waiting to respond but actually listening, following the thread to its end before engaging with it. He came back on the 6th day with a different query. On the 8th day, he came without a specific query and stayed for 40 minutes discussing the broader patterns in the ceremonial record that her documentation had surfaced. She used wit as deflection when the conversations moved toward warmth. He found her wit interesting in the specific way that people found interesting the things they had not anticipated encountering. She performed her careful distances with precision. He noticed her performing them. She knew he noticed because he did what he always did with things he had noticed and chosen not to address yet. He absorbed them without comment and proceeded from the information they provided, which was considerably more unsettling than if he had simply said something. Lord Edrin arrived at the king's court on the 12th day. He came for a scheduled political meeting. His Pax trade agreements were under annual review, a routine matter. Nothing that should have produced the specific quality of cold that moved through Sera's chest when she looked up from the ceremonial records and found him standing in the entrance to the eastern hall, with his expression moving through surprise, calculation, and the specific cold construction of a man identifying a resource he had not expected to find available. She did not stand. She did not adjust her posture or her expression. She looked at him across the records hall with the same quality of stillness she had brought to the council chamber and the sacred grove, and every other moment that had required her to absorb something without releasing it. He said nothing to her directly. He was too careful for that. Whatever he was building, he was going to build it through the court's channels rather than in the records hall doorway with a witness present. Kalen entered the hall 2 minutes later. He read the room in approximately 4 seconds. She watched him do it, the specific quality of his attention reorganizing itself as it absorbed Edrin's position, her expression, the space between them, and the meaning of all three. Lord Edrin, he said with the particular neutrality of a man who had decided his tone and was applying it consistently. Allow me to introduce the court's ceremonial record consultant, whose work on this season's documentation has been indispensable. Edrin's smile did not change. Sera's expression did not change. But she felt the gray cord on her wrist with a new quality of awareness, not the familiar weight of a classification she had worn since childhood, but something more acute. The awareness of a thing that had been part of the background of her life, suddenly asserting itself as foreground, indispensable. She had never been called indispensable in 22 years of trying. She returned to her documentation and did not examine the specific quality of what that word had done in her chest when she heard it, because examining it would require acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would require deciding what to do with it, and she was not ready for that accounting yet. She was almost ready. Chapter 4. The season's most significant ceremony was scheduled for the 19th day, and the preparation for it required a level of documentation that Sera had been building toward since the first week. Cross-referencing 4 centuries of precedent against the current season's specific variables, producing a record that would satisfy both the historical requirements and the practical needs of a ceremony that had not been performed in its complete form for 11 years. She had been working on it for 16 days. On the morning of the 18th day, she sat down on the floor of the Eastern Records Hall. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone making a statement, simply in the specific way of someone whose legs had reached a decision independently of the rest of her. Knees folding, descent managed enough to be deliberate rather than a collapse. Back finding the shelving unit behind her with the particular relief of something that has been upright for a long time finally encountering a surface. She was not injured. She was not unwell in any way that the healers could have addressed. She was the specific exhaustion of 3 weeks of performing at the highest level she had ever been asked to perform at, in a space that demanded that level and received it, while simultaneously managing the internal cost of something she had not yet given herself permission to name. She sat on the floor with her documentation in her lap and the gray cord on her wrist and her eyes closed, and she did what she had never had the luxury of doing in 22 years of Ashenmore. She stopped. Just stopped. Not forever. Not as a decision. Simply as a fact. She was on the floor, and she was still, and the records hall was quiet around her, and that was what was happening. Kaylin found her 14 minutes later. She knew from the quality of the silence that preceded his entrance that it was him before she opened her eyes. The specific way the air in a space reorganized itself when he entered it, which she had catalogued without meaning to over 19 days of sharing corridors and records halls, and the particular proximity of two people working on adjacent problems in the same building. He looked at her. He sat down beside her. Not in a chair. Beside her, on the floor, with his back against the adjacent section of shelving and his long legs stretched out in front of him, in the plain, unhurried manner of someone who had assessed the situation and determined that the floor was the correct location for this conversation. They sat in silence for a while. The records hall held the quiet around them. Outside the high windows, the afternoon was doing what afternoons did in the ceremonial season, moving through its light in long, slow progressions that the ancient architecture had been designed to track, and which Sera had spent 19 days finding more beautiful than she had expected. "I have been trying," she said without deciding to say it, "to earn my place in every room I have ever stood in." She felt him listen. Not the performance of listening, the actual thing, the quality of attention that oriented itself toward her words and followed them. Every room. Since I was old enough to understand that the gray cord meant my presence in any space was conditional, that I was there on sufferance, and the sufferance was renewable only through continued demonstration of utility. She paused. I became very good at being useful. It was the only architecture available. The hall was quiet. "I walked into your sacred grove without permission," she said, "without preparation, without any of the careful advance work I bring to every space I enter. I stumbled into it because I had nowhere else to go that night, and it was there." She looked at her hands in her lap. "It is the first place I have ever been where I did not immediately begin calculating what I needed to do to justify my presence." Kaylin was quiet for a moment. Then, "You have been in that grove before." She looked at him. "Not that night," he said. "Before. I know your scent from before that night." He was looking at the floor. "I have known it for a very long time." She looked at his profile in the afternoon light, the steadiness of him, the floor sitting, the 19 days of documentation queries that had not been about documentation, and felt something move through her chest that she had been carefully budgeting against. Neither of them addressed what his words meant. By morning, she was back at the records, and he was back in his council meetings, and the careful distances were reinstated with the mutual efficiency of two people who had agreed, without discussing it, to return to the arrangement until they were ready for what came next. But the gray cord on her wrist sat differently. She noticed this. She filed it. She was not yet ready. She was becoming ready. Chapter 5. Edrin moved on the 24th day. She had known he would, had been watching for the shape of it since he walked into the records hall doorway on the 12th day, and she saw the calculation begin behind his eyes. Edrin was a careful man. He did not act without architecture. He built things with the patience of someone who understood that premature action was the primary cause of avoidable failure, and he had spent 12 days building whatever he was building with the particular thoroughness of a man who intended to get it right. What he built was an afternoon. Sera was walking back from the ceremonial hall through the outer corridor, the documentation complete, the senior archivist's approval received, the season's most significant ceremony 48 hours away, and her official function substantially discharged. She was thinking about the 4 days remaining, about the arrangement and its conclusion, about the specific quality of what happened to temporary things when their time ran out. She passed a door that stood slightly open. She was not trying to hear anything. She was walking at her ordinary pace, and the door was open, and the voices were there before she had made any decision about them. Kalen's voice, his beta Soren, the low, direct register of men in a practical conversation. The Ashenmore girl? She did not slow down. The season concludes in 4 days. What happens after? Kalen's voice. She returns to Ashenmore. That was the arrangement. A pause. The court cannot sustain the disruption indefinitely. She had passed the door. She kept walking. She did not hear what came after. She did not hear Soren's response, or what Kalen said next. She heard the door behind her and the corridor ahead of her, and the gray cord on her wrist and the specific cold sensation of a floor she had been walking on for 24 days, revealing the drop it had been concealing all along. She knew this was the arrangement. She had named it herself. 4 weeks, she had said, and at the end of 4 weeks, she left freely with no claim from any direction. She had constructed these conditions with care because she understood what she was protecting herself from, and she had built the protection in advance. She had then spent 24 days forgetting that she had built it. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She reached up and untied the gray cord from her wrist, not to remove it, simply to hold it. And she sat with it in both hands, and she looked at it, and she made herself look at it honestly. She was a low-rank wolf from Ashenmore. She had been classified as such since she was 4 years old by a system that had decided, before she was old enough to demonstrate anything, that she was born beneath the level where effort made a difference. She had walked into a sacred grove by accident, and a king had stopped a ceremony for her, and she had spent 24 days becoming something she had not known she could be, and none of it changed the gray cord. None of it changed Ashenmore. The arrangement was 4 days from concluding, and what she had in those 4 days, as distinct from what she had permitted herself to imagine she had, was a temporary position in a court that could not sustain the disruption indefinitely. She looked at the cord. Some wolves are simply born beneath the level where effort makes a difference. She had spent 22 years refusing to believe this. She was sitting in a room in the king's court with 4 days left on a temporary arrangement, and the gray cord in her hands, and the specific question of whether she had been refusing to believe it because it was untrue or because believing it was unbearable. She tied the cord back around her wrist. She went to request a formal meeting with the Alpha King. Chapter 6. She chose the official meeting room deliberately. The private receiving chamber was where he had made her the offer, where the arrangement lived, to where the writing materials had been placed in advance, and the seal had been applied, and the document had been signed. She did not want that room for this conversation. She wanted the official room, with its formal furniture and its neutral walls and the specific impersonality of a space that existed for transactions rather than anything else. He was there when she arrived, sitting at the table, not behind it, beside it, in the way he arranged himself in spaces when he was not performing his authority, which she had learned to read as his actual register rather than his public one. He looked at her when she entered with the expression she had been catching at the edges for 24 days and looking away from. She sat across the table from him. She had prepared the speech carefully. She was good at preparation. She delivered it with the precision she brought to documentation, clearly, completely, without unnecessary elaboration. She thanked him for the 4 weeks. She confirmed the ceremonial documentation was complete and approved. She confirmed her official function had been fully discharged. She told him she intended to leave tomorrow morning, early, before the court assembled, before the formal conclusion of the season, because she had learned, at some cost, that she was better at clean endings than at staying past the point where staying became something other than what it was contracted to be. She stood. She moved toward the door. "You did not hear the rest of what I said." She stopped. Her hand found the gray cord on her wrist without her deciding to reach for it. "In the corridor," he said behind her. 4 days ago, you were walking past and the door was open. You heard fragments." She stood at the door. "You left," he said, before the sentence finished. The official meeting room was very quiet around them. She turned around. He had stood up from the table. He was not behind it. He was at its side, in the space between the table and her, and he was looking at her with the expression she had stopped avoiding and was now looking at directly, and it was not what she had expected. It was not the composed authority of the Alpha King or the careful professional regard of the man who had made her an offer in a private receiving chamber. It was something older and less managed than either of those things. Something that had been there, she understood, for longer than 24 days, considerably longer. "Tell me," she said. Chapter 7. He crossed the room. He stopped close enough that she was aware of the specific quality of the space between them. Not the professional distances of the past 24 days, but something the professional distances had been managing, containing, governing with the particular precision of a man who had decided that what he was feeling was not the problem, but the timing was. The full sentence, he said, was, "The court cannot sustain the disruption indefinitely, which is why I intend to make her presence here permanent." She looked at him. "I was speaking to Soren," he said, "because Soren is the only member of this court whose discretion I trust with what I was planning." The conversation you partially heard was the beginning of a considerably longer conversation about how to restructure your standing here in a way that does not require the pretext of the ceremonial record. "Permanent," she said. Permanent, he said. She looked at him steadily. Why? He held her gaze. Because I have been looking for you for 20 years, and I am not prepared to watch you walk back to Ashenmore in 4 days. The official meeting room was very still. You said, she said carefully, in the records hall, that you knew my scent from before the grove. Yes, he said. From where? She said. He was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of a man deciding to say something completely, without the managed partial disclosure that power sometimes produced in people who had learned to control what they revealed. I was 9 years old, he said. There was a moon festival, an interpack gathering, the kind that happens every 3 years when the ceremonial calendar aligns. My father brought me as part of my education in pack relations. I was not yet alpha. I was a boy at a festival being instructed in the geography of the territory he would one day inherit. He paused. There was a girl, he said, at the festival's edge. Not at its center. At its edge, which was where I was told the lower rank wolves stood, because the center was reserved for the senior wolves and their families. She was watching the ceremony with the complete, patient attention of someone who found everything worth seeing. Not performing attention. Not looking around at the crowd or fidgeting or doing any of the things that 7-year-olds did at events that were too long for them. Simply watching with the full quality of someone who had decided this was worth watching and was watching it completely. Something moved in Sera's chest. My wolf, he said, went quiet. He said it simply, as a fact. I was 9. My wolf was young and unformed and not yet capable of understanding what it was responding to. But it went quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before. The specific silence of something that has been making noise for as long as it has existed and has suddenly encountered what the noise was always searching for. You never spoke to me, she said. You were at the festival's edge, and I was at its center. And I was 9 years old, and my father's beta came to move me to the next educational station before I had decided what to do about the stillness in my chest. Something that was almost a different quality of expression moved through his face. I did not know your name. I did not know your pack. I knew your scent. The way you knew things before you had the language for them. And I have been carrying it for 20 years without being able to locate its source. She looked at him. I have attended every interpack ceremony, he said. Every seasonal gathering, every formal occasion at which Ashenmore Pack was represented for 20 years. I have been looking for you in crowds at festivals and diplomatic functions and border meetings, and I have not been able to find you because you were always in the back of the room, or in the service corridor, or in the space between spaces where low-rank wolves learned to make themselves invisible. And then I walked into your grove, she said. And then you walked into my grove, he said, and crouched behind a silverwood tree, and your scent reached me across 40 feet of sacred ceremony, and my wolf went quiet for the second time in 20 years. She pressed her hand against the gray cord on her wrist. The pretext, she said, the ceremonial record, was the thinnest architecture I could construct, he said, on 4 days' notice between the moment I stepped toward you in the grove and the moment I needed a reason for my court. I needed you to stay. I needed a reason the law would accept, He paused. It was the best I had. She looked at him for a long moment. At the 20 years he had just laid across the space between them, at the moon festival and the quiet wolf, and the 20 years of interpack ceremonies, attended in the hope of finding the source of something he had been carrying since he was 9 years old. Edrin said, she said, that some wolves are simply born beneath the level where effort makes a difference. Edrin, Kaelin said, with the particular flatness of a man applying tremendous precision to a very controlled response, has been under governance review for 14 months. The documentation your work has produced in 4 weeks will accelerate that review considerably. That is not what I asked, she said. He looked at her directly. No, he said. You are not beneath anything. You were never beneath anything. You were in the back of the room and in the service corridor and in the space between spaces because a system decided, before you were old enough to demonstrate otherwise, that you belonged there. And I have been the most powerful wolf in 4 territories for 12 years, and I have not been able to do anything about that system until you walked into my grove and gave me a reason the law would accept. And now, she said. And now, he said, I have the reason. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and untied the gray cord from her wrist. She held it for a moment. The familiar weight of it, 22 years of classification, the accumulated sediment of a system that had decided what she was before she had the chance to demonstrate anything different. She set it on the table between them, not thrown, placed. With the deliberateness of someone who had decided something and was making the decision legible. She looked at the cord on the table. She looked at him. She crossed the room. Epilogue. 7 months later. The sacred grove in early spring was nothing like the sacred grove on a ceremony night in autumn. The torches were gone. The 100 wolves were gone. The particular weight of ritual that had pressed down on the space like a second canopy had lifted with the season and left behind something lighter and more ordinary. The grove as it actually was when it was not performing its sacred function, which was to say old and dense and beautiful in the specific unhurried way of things that had been growing undisturbed for long enough to have become entirely themselves. Sera stood at the grove's center, not behind the silverwood tree, not at the northern edge where the moss had held the impression of her knees on a night that now felt both very close and very distant. At the center, the ceremony's center, the altar's position, the place where Kaelin had stood when his head had lifted and his eyes had found her across 40 feet of sacred dark. She stood there and felt the morning light come through the canopy in long gold columns, and she felt, beneath the light, the particular quality of a space that had been significant to her twice and was now significant in a completely different way. Edrin's fate had arrived 4 months ago in the form Kaelin's governance review produced. Thorough, documented, and delivered with the specific precision that Ironwood applied to everything it decided mattered. The 14-month review, substantially accelerated by the ceremonial documentation Sera had produced in 4 weeks, and the broader administrative record that Kaelin's archivist had been compiling since the morning after the grove, had concluded unanimously. Lord Edrin had been formally censured by the Interpack Council. Ashenmore Pack's ranking system had been restructured under independent review. The gray cord insignia had been abolished from pack law entirely, not just in Ashenmore, but across all affiliated territories, following a precedent motion that Kalen had submitted to the council himself on the morning after the official meeting room. She had read the council's decision and felt the specific quality of something completing itself. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, simply the clean sensation of an accounting that had been conducted correctly and had produced an accurate result. She stood in the grove's center with her wrist bare. The skin where the cord had been was pale, 22 years of being covered, the specific paleness of something that had not seen direct light in a very long time. She had noticed this in the first days after removing it. The paleness, the slight sensitivity of skin that had been under something for so long it had forgotten what open air felt like. It was adjusting. She looked at her bare wrist in the morning light and thought about the girl at the Moon Festival's edge who had been watching the ceremony with complete attention and had not known, at 7 years old, that there was a boy on the other side of the crowd whose wolf had gone quiet in response to something he would spend the next 20 years being unable to explain. She thought about effort and thresholds and the specific architecture of believing something because the alternative was unbearable. She had been right, she thought, not about the threshold. The threshold had been a fiction, as Edrin had correctly, if cruelly noted, but about the effort. Not because effort had eventually broken through the system. It hadn't, not by itself. But because the effort had kept her present, had kept her in the rooms, and in the service corridors, and in the spaces between spaces, had kept her walking into a forest on a Tuesday night when she had nowhere else to go, had put her behind a silverwood tree in a sacred grove where a king's head had lifted and his eyes had found her, and everything had followed from that. She heard the grove go quiet behind her in the specific way it went quiet when Kalen entered it. She did not turn around immediately. She gave herself one more moment at the center. The morning light, the old canopy, the bare wrist in the gold spring air. And she felt the full weight of what she was standing in and what she was no longer carrying and what, for the first time in 22 years, she simply was, without the cord's qualifying presence. Then she turned. He crossed the grove directly to her. No detour, no ceremony, in the same unhurried directness with which he crossed every space between himself and her. He looked at her wrist, at the bare skin in the morning light, then at her face. He did not ask. She did not explain. She reached over and took his hand, and they stood together at the center of the sacred grove in the early spring morning, in the place where the procedure had failed to account for what he did, where the 100 wolves had watched their king take one step toward a nobody from Ashenmore, and the world had quietly, irrevocably reorganized itself accordingly. Above them, the ancient silverwood canopy held the light and gave it back in the particular silver that gave the trees their name. It was very beautiful. She had always thought it was very beautiful. Wolf Pack, if you stayed until the very last word, you know what it means when a king stops a ceremony for your scent. Drop a comment in the comments and tell me. When Kalen introduced her as indispensable to Edrin's face in Chapter 3, Did you feel that moment? And when she set the gray cord on the table, did you hold your breath? Like this story, subscribe so the wolf pack never misses what comes next, and let's see how far Sarah's story travels.